What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the channel. We're going to be talking about the Hunger Games Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This is a prequel to the Hunger Games set 64 years before the events of Katniss and Peeta, as we see how President Santadouche became President Santadouche. Now, going into this movie, I have never read any of the books, so I'm going in as somewhat clean as I possibly can. I've seen the other 4 films. I enjoyed the first 2. The last 2 were really hit and miss for me personally, but I was somewhat intrigued to see how President Santadouche became President Santadouche. As far as prequels go, I think this does a really good job of standing on its own while also referencing things that happen in the future. Like, you get a couple of Easter eggs here and there, but it's not really reliant on a lot of those Easter eggs. They just sprinkle them in here and there for the fans. So if you're somebody that has never read any of the books or seen any of the other movies, I think you're going to be able to follow this movie just fine. You'll just miss a couple of the nuances here and there, but I think as a prequel, it does its job right and getting the performances out of the way, because there's not a surprise in this film. Everybody brought their A games, and Viola Davis and Peter Dinklage are absolutely evil in this movie, and they are deliciously evil. I absolutely loved every single moment that they were on screen. They brought a ferociousness that we see later on in President Snow, and see how much of that really affects him. I really love it when they were on screen. They don't have a big presence on screen, but boy, did they make an impact on the screen. When it comes down to Tom Blythe, who plays Cornelius Snow, I thought he was absolutely great. Now, this was my first time that I've ever seen him in anything, so it was great to see him go from mentor to rapper to what eventually will be President Santadouche. And I thought Tom Blythe was great as Cornelius Snow. There were a lot of different dimensions to him that this movie kind of made you sympathize with him a little bit, and it really humanized him just a little bit, but you know exactly what kind of road he's going to be taking. And so I really love that about him. I really love the relationship that they built between Rachel Zegler and Tom Blythe, but I'm going to be getting into my nitpicks about that relationship as we move on towards negatives. I thought the chemistry between Rachel Zegler and Tom Blythe, I thought, was absolutely fantastic. They made me buy that relationship, and it really did make me want to see this relationship blossom. When it came down to Rachel Zegler, it took me a little while for me to get used to her accent, because she has a bit of a southern drawl accent in here. So it took me a little while for me to get used to that accent. But as soon as you get to know this character a little bit more, it starts to grow on you, and it doesn't become as distracting as I thought it was going to. Mostly because I didn't hear that accent in the trailer. So it was kind of surprising for me to hear that in the film. So it took me a little while, but once I got used to this character, it fit right in. And when it came down to the Hunger Games, this is a violent movie. So I would caution anybody that has kids or are planning to take their kids to this film. I would caution about that, because I would suggest you watch this movie first and make sure it's okay for your kids, because there are a lot of subscriptions to life that end in this movie, and they end in a very PG-13 type of fashion. But the impact that it made, the way that it's visually told on screen, it is very haunting and disturbing to see on screen. And I thought that is where Francis Lawrence really made an impact. Even though he did direct The Hunger Games Catching Fire, which is the best film even after watching this film, I really enjoyed that one a lot more than I enjoyed this film. But what Francis Lawrence was able to do is bring us back into that world, bring us into the world of Pan Am, and just bring us back into the games. And they get really violent. The way he shoots the games is absolutely fantastic, especially when it came down to the perspective of Rachel Zegler's character. I thought it was done fantastically. The cinematography for this movie is absolutely great. There are a lot of great setup moments as we move on into the first Hunger Games, and I thought it absolutely worked for me personally. There wasn't a moment where the movie lagged in the first 2 acts. I thought when we were in the first 2 acts, when we were getting to know Lucy and Cornelius, I thought that is where the movie was absolutely singing, and I thought that is where the pacing of the movie absolutely worked for me, because we were moving at a neck break speed. There wasn't a lot of moments where it was dulling. You were always intrigued. There was always something happening on screen, so you're always focused to these 2 characters. and you want to see what kind of relationship they're going to have. But really, the one that stole the film was Jason Schwartzman as Lucky Flickerman. He is the first host of the Hunger Games, and what I really love about his performance and about his character is that he wasn't trying to do a Stanley Tucci imitation. He really did bring his own style to this character. He was really more of the comic relief for the first two acts of the film, and every little piece of dialogue absolutely fit, even though at times it does feel like he is in a different film, because even when you're in the games and there's a lot of tension going on, there's a lot of heaviness, we cut back to him to really relieve us of that tension, and he was just absolutely great. He was the standout of the movie. Like, if there's anything wrong with this movie, if this movie was the biggest pile of dog shit, really the biggest praise that I could give would have been Jason Schwartzman, because he was absolutely great. He was able to bring what Stanley Tucci was able to bring to his character, but also make it his own, but also not overdo it as one would probably be worried about. But going into a couple of the things that really bother me, I think while the first two acts of this film are particularly strong, I think it works. I think it moves at a really nice speed when we get into the third act of the film, or the third chapter of the film, because this film is broken down into three chapters. Once we get moving into the third chapter of this film, that is where the movie started to take a little bit of a dip for me, because while there are things that I really liked about the third act that worked for me, there was a lot of it that really didn't work for me, and most of it has to do with the YA tropes that we see in these Hunger Games films. That is where I felt the pacing of the film, and that is where you could have shaved a couple of things off just a little bit to shorten down the film, because it is about 2 hours and 37 minutes, and you kind of feel the runtime once we move into the third act, because once we get into the third act of the film, that is where it feels like Francis Lawrence took a hiatus from the film, and it loses all of its momentum that it was really building and really had there. And so there are things in the third act that I liked, and there are things that I kind of wish would have shaved off a little bit. But the conclusion of the film, I thought, worked well enough to get me on board and see a sequel for this film, because even though this is a prequel, you know exactly how these characters are going to end up. So if this movie does well, I will be there day one to see the sequel, because I want to see the continuing chapter of this film. It was just the fact that there were a couple of things in the third act took the quality down for me personally, and it didn't work for me as much as it should have. But those are my thoughts on the Hunger Games Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Are you guys planning on checking this film out, or do you guys just have no interest in this film? Go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys soon.